What if I told you Ford built an engine so powerful, so radical, that NASCAR banned it before it ever hit the track? This wasn't just another V8. This was an engineering monster. The Ford 427 sohc Camry was designed to crush Chrysler's 426 Hemi, obliterate lap records, and dominate the sport forever. But just as Ford prepared to unleash it, NASCAR shut it down. Why? Was it too fast, too advanced, or was there a deeper conspiracy at play? The truth behind the Camry's ban is more shocking than you think. By the early 1960s, Ford was in trouble. Chrysler had unleashed the 426 Hemi, a monstrous powerhouse that dominated NASCAR and sent Ford scrambling for a response. The Hemi was winning races, breaking records, and making Ford's engines look obsolete. Every time a Ford car rolled up to the grid, it was already at a disadvantage. Ford had only one option: fight fire with fire. They needed an engine so fast, so extreme, that it would turn the tables overnight. But there was a problem: they didn't have time. Designing a new engine from scratch could take years, and Chrysler wasn't slowing down. That's when Ford's top engineers devised a radical solution. Instead of creating an entirely new power plant, they would take their existing 427 FE big block and transform it into something revolutionary. The result? The sohc 427, an overhead cam beast that pushed performance beyond anything NASCAR had ever seen. It wasn't just an engine, it was a war machine, one that would either save Ford's racing future or get them banned from competition forever. And as history would prove, NASCAR wasn't ready for what Ford had just created. The Ford 427 sohc Camry wasn't just another V8, it was a mechanical revolution. At a time when pushrod engines ruled the tracks, Ford did something unthinkable. They threw out the old design and replaced it with cutting-edge technology. The key innovation? Single overhead cams, sohc. Instead of a traditional camshaft buried inside the block, Ford mounted massive cams directly above the valves, eliminating push rods and drastically improving airflow. The result? Higher RPMs, better efficiency, and raw, untamed power. The specs were jaw-dropping: 7.0 liters of displacement, massive hemispherical combustion chambers, and intake ports the size of a grown man's fist. Ford engineers strapped it to a dyno, expecting around 500 horsepower. They were wrong. Early tests showed the Camry easily exceeded 600 horsepower, and that was before any fine-tuning. Some say race-prepped versions were pushing closer to 700 horsepower, numbers that could obliterate the competition. Ford had done it. They had built a monster that could put the Hemi in its grave, but that's when everything went wrong. Because as soon as the racing world saw what the Camry could do, NASCAR made a decision that would change history forever. The Ford 427 sohc Camry wasn't just fast, it was terrifyingly powerful. NASCAR teams took one look at the dyno sheets and knew this engine would rewrite the record books. Ford had created a 7,000 RPM monster that could out-rev, out-power, and outlast the legendary Hemi. With its massive 2.25-inch intake valves, an overhead cam design that eliminated push-rod inefficiencies, and a timing chain nearly 6 feet long, this wasn't just an improvement, it was a revolution. The Hemi, long thought to be the king of NASCAR, was suddenly on the chopping block. Ford's test results showed something NASCAR wasn't ready to handle. Stock version? Over 600 horsepower. Race-tuned? Closer to 700 horsepower. Drag racing variants? Some claimed over 800 horsepower. Nothing else came close. The sohc 427 revved higher, breathed better, and made more power than anything else on the track. But just as Ford's team started preparing their race cars for total domination, something suspicious happened. NASCAR suddenly changed the rules, banning overhead cam designs just months before the Camry could even hit the track. Why? Who was behind this last-minute decision? And more importantly, what were they trying to hide? Ford had done the impossible. They had built an engine that could bury the Hemi, shatter lap records, and dominate NASCAR for years. But before a single car could hit the track, NASCAR dropped the hammer. Overhead cam engines were officially banned. Just like that, the 427 SOHC was dead in NASCAR before it even had a chance to race. Why? NASCAR claimed it was because the camera was too expensive for other teams to develop, but that excuse doesn't hold up. Chrysler had been given free rein to develop the 426 Hemi, an engine far more expensive to build than Ford's reworked 427. So what was the real reason? Some say it was pure politics. NASCAR had long been a Chrysler-dominated playground, and the Hemi was its golden ticket. If Ford's camera made the Hemi look slow, the entire power structure of the sport would crumble. Others believe Ford's advancement was simply too far ahead of its time, an engine that could change NASCAR forever, forcing teams to abandon pushrod V8s for high-tech overhead cams. Either way, Ford's dream of NASCAR domination was over, but the camera wasn't done yet. It was about to find an even deadlier battlefield. The ban on the SOHC 427 wasn't just about cost, it was a power move. Pure and simple. NASCAR had no problem letting Chrysler run their brand new 426 Hemi, an engine that had been developed specifically for racing and had obliterated the competition in its debut. So why was Ford's engine suddenly too advanced for the sport? Some believe Chrysler lobbied NASCAR behind closed doors, terrified of what the SOHC 427 could do. The Hemi had just taken over NASCAR. If Ford's new weapon hit the track, that dominance would be over in a heartbeat. Others suspect NASCAR itself had a hidden agenda. The sanctioning body had grown comfortable with Chrysler's growing influence, and letting Ford introduce a technological masterpiece like the camera could have disrupted the balance of power forever. Then there's the wildest theory of them all, that Ford's own executives didn't fight hard enough to keep the camera alive. With Ford's focus shifting to Le Mans and international racing, was the SOHC 427 quietly sacrificed? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: this was never just about fairness. The most advanced engine of its time had been erased before it could even prove itself. But Ford wasn't done fighting. They had another plan for the camera, and this time there would be no rules to stop it. If NASCAR wouldn't let the 427 SOHC camera race, Ford had only one choice: take the fight elsewhere. And what better battlefield than the quarter-mile drag strip where rules didn't matter and raw power reigned supreme? The camera didn't just survive in drag racing, it became a legend overnight. Ford shipped these banned engines straight into the hands of drag racers, and what happened next sent shockwaves through the sport. In top-fuel dragsters, the SOHC 427 pushed well past 800 horsepower, and that was just the beginning. Some builds with exotic tuning and nitromethane fuel were rumored to exceed 1,500 horsepower. Drag legends like Don the Snake Prudhomme and Connie Kalitta took the camera into NHRA top-fuel racing, and suddenly Chrysler's Hemi was no longer untouchable. Ford's revenge had begun. The 427 SOHC-powered dragsters were setting record times, obliterating competitors, and proving that NASCAR had made a huge mistake banning it. But then, NHRA stepped in. Ford had found a new home for the camera, but once again the rulemakers had other plans. Would the SOHC 427 be erased from history yet again, or would it find yet another way to survive? Just when Ford's 427 SOHC camera was proving itself as an unstoppable force on the drag strip, the NHRA decided it was too much. Sound familiar? Much like NASCAR, the NHRA couldn't handle what the camera was doing to the competition. With its massive power output, high-revving nature, and cutting-edge design, the SOHC 427 was making other engines obsolete. Ford-powered top-fuel dragsters were clocking insane speeds, winning races, and embarrassing Chrysler's 426 Hemi. The response? Rule changes. First, NHRA imposed weight penalties, forcing camera-powered cars to carry extra weight compared to Hemi-powered dragsters. Then, they introduced restrictions on fuel and supercharging, effectively limiting the engine's performance. And just like that, history repeated itself. The most advanced engine of its time was once again shackled by politics, not performance. But the camera refused to die. Even with NHRA's restrictions, it continued to be a weapon of destruction in outlaw drag racing, street racing, and underground competitions. Ford had built a monster they couldn't contain, and despite the bans, the SOHC 427 was about to leave its mark on the streets in a way no one could stop. With NASCAR and NHRA both turning their backs on the 427 SOHC, Ford had a decision to make: scrap the engine entirely or let it loose on the streets. They chose war. Ford quietly started slipping the camera into factory-backed race cars, creating some of the most powerful street machines the world had ever seen. These weren't mass-produced models you could buy at a dealership. They were hand-built assassins designed to hunt down and humiliate anything that dared challenge them. The Ford Mustang, Fairlane, Galaxie, and Thunderbolt became camera-powered beasts, tearing up drag strips, illegal street races, and underground competitions. These cars weren't just fast. They were weapons. In the right hands, a SOHC-powered Mustang or Fairlane was unstoppable. These cars shattered speed records and forced GM and Chrysler to rethink everything they knew about performance. But there was a problem. Ford never made the camera street legal. It was too wild, too advanced, and too dominant to be tamed. And when Ford executives decided to pull the plug on the engine's future, the SOHC 427 became an instant legend, a piece of forbidden history. But that didn't stop hardcore racers from keeping its legacy alive in the shadows. When Ford pulled the plug on the 427 SOHC camera, it should have been the end of the story. But legends don't die that easily. While NASCAR and NHRA may have banned it, a secret underground movement was just getting started. The camera found its way into the hands of a new breed of racers, outlaws who didn't care about rules, only speed. These weren't just weekend warriors. They were street racers, moonshiners, and underground drag racers looking for an edge over anything that crossed their path. And nothing, not a big block Chevy, not a Chrysler Hemi, not even the police, could match the sheer brutality of a camera-powered car. The engine became a mythical figure in the world of illegal street racing. Those who had one kept it hidden, only revealing its power when it was time to race for serious money. Stories spread of mysterious Fords lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to humiliate the competition. And because Ford never made it street legal, owning a camera became a badge of honor. If you had one, you weren't just a racer. You were part of an exclusive, elite underground club. The 427 SOHC was never meant to survive. But in the hands of street racers, it became immortal. The Ford 427 SOHC camera should have been the most dominant engine of its era. It had the power, the technology, and the ability to change racing forever, but instead, it disappeared. How does an engine so legendary just vanish? Some blame Ford itself. By the late 1960s, Ford's focus had shifted from stock car and drag racing to conquering Le Mans. The company was pouring millions into the GT40 program, aiming to take down Ferrari on the world stage. The camera became a forgotten project, abandoned in favor of endurance racing. Others point to federal regulations. The late 60s brought emissions restrictions and insurance crackdowns on high-performance cars. An engine like the SOHC 427, too powerful, too extreme, had no future in a world obsessed with tightening regulations. And then there are the whispers of conspiracy. Did NASCAR and Chrysler work behind the scenes to make sure the camera never came back? Some believe Ford was pressured into shelving the engine to maintain balance in racing. Whatever the truth, by the early 1970s, the camera had all but disappeared from the mainstream. But as we've seen before, true legends never really die. With the 427 SOHC camera banned from NASCAR, restricted in NHRA, and never officially released for street cars, Ford quietly stopped production. But what happened to the engines that had already been built? Some were scrapped, some were locked away in Ford's vaults, and others vanished without a trace. But a few, a very rare few, escaped. Whispers in the racing world tell of hidden camera engines sitting in private collections, forgotten warehouses, and secret Ford test facilities. Some claim that Ford engineers smuggled a handful of them out before the project was shut down, slipping them into the hands of underground racers who knew exactly what to do with them. Every now and then, a 427 SOHC resurfaces at an auction or in the back of an old speed shop, covered in dust but still carrying the same untamed power that made it legendary. And when one does, collectors and racers alike go to war to get their hands on it. They say if you listen carefully at certain drag strips, you can still hear the scream of a camera tearing down the quarter mile, proof that Ford's forbidden engine refuses to be forgotten. What if I told you the 427 SOHC never truly died? While Ford may have officially abandoned the camera, the legend never faded. Hardcore engine builders, collectors, and racers have spent decades resurrecting and modifying this once-banned masterpiece. Some of the original engines have been carefully rebuilt, tuned, and dropped into vintage dragsters, street cars, and even modern muscle machines. These aren't just museum pieces, they're still making power, still setting records, and still proving that the SOHC 427 was decades ahead of its time. But the real question is, could Ford bring it back? With today's technology, modern machining, fuel injection, advanced tuning techniques, imagine what a modern version of the camera could do. A factory-built 7.0-liter twin-cam monster with today's engineering could easily surpass 1,000 horsepower, naturally aspirated. And here's the craziest part. Some Ford engineers have hinted that they've never truly forgotten the camera. While Ford's focus today is on modular engines and electric powertrains, deep inside the blue oval, there are still those who dream of bringing back the greatest engine they ever built. The camera wasn't just ahead of its time. Maybe its time hasn't even come yet. The Ford 427 SOHC camera should have been nothing more than a forgotten experiment, buried by politics and regulations. But instead it became one of the most legendary engines in automotive history, not because of what it did on the track, but because of what it could have done. Even after being banned, restricted, and left to rot, the camera's legend only grew. It became the holy grail for Ford enthusiasts, a symbol of what happens when corporations play it safe while engineers chase perfection. Its influence still echoes today. The camera's overhead cam technology paved the way for modern high-performance engines, influencing Ford's 4.6-liter and 5.4-liter modular V8s decades later. Every time you see a DOHC Ford Mustang, you're looking at the camera's DNA in action. But more than just its tech, the camera represents something bigger, the ultimate what if in racing history. What if NASCAR had allowed it to compete? What if NHRA hadn't restricted it? What if Ford had built a street version? One thing is certain, the camera wasn't just an engine, it was a revolution that never got to happen. Or maybe its story isn't over yet. The Ford 427 SOHC camera wasn't banned because it was unfair. It wasn't outlawed because it was expensive. It was killed because it was too good. Think about it. NASCAR let Chrysler's 426 Hemi dominate without restriction. The NHRA gave Hemi-powered dragsters free rein to rule the quarter mile. But the second Ford unleashed an engine that could outpower them all. The rulemakers shut it down. Was it politics? Was it fear? Or was it a calculated move to keep Ford from rewriting racing history forever? One thing is clear. The camera was never given its moment. It was designed to change the game, to push the limits of speed and engineering, to humiliate Chrysler and GM on the track. Instead, it was erased. Or so they thought. Because the truth is, the camera never really died. It lives on in the underground, in collectors' garages, in outlaw dragsters, in the whispers of old Ford engineers who knew they had built something special. And who knows? Maybe one day Ford will finally give the camera the race it was born to win. Because legends don't die, they just wait.